My stepmother kicked me out of the house, then returned years later claiming I was her only son and I have to help her and it's strange, really, the way the past has a knack for finding you even when you think you've buried it deep enough. My past came crashing back into my life just a few months ago in the form of a voicemail. I'd never forgotten Stella, though I had tried for years to erase every trace of her from my memory. But it's hard to forget the person who turned your childhood upside down. Stella came into my life when I was 12, a year after my mom, Hannah, died. My dad, Ray, had always been a good man, and my mom was the love of his life. Losing her shattered both of us, and there was this unspoken understanding between us. Things would never be the same. But then, like a force of nature, Stella entered. Tall, blonde, charming in a way that felt almost too smooth. She took over our house, our lives, with a fierceness that I didn't know how to combat at the time. At first, Dad was happy with her. He believed she could bring stability back into our broken family. For a short while, it seemed possible. But it didn't take long for Stella's mask to slip. She had this way of subtly shifting blame and guilt, of making me feel like I was always in the wrong. Every disagreement, every moment of tension, she twisted until I felt like an outsider in my own home. Slowly, she started to wedge herself between me and my dad. By the time I was 16, it felt like I was just a guest in their house. Stella always had these house rules that seemed designed to make me feel powerless. I remember one day she packed up all my mom's things, stuffed them into boxes, and shoved them in the attic. When I protested, she said, "It's time to move on, Caleb. You need to let go." But I wasn't ready to let go. I couldn't believe Dad just stood there, looking tired and defeated, as if he didn't have a say in the matter. The breaking point came not long after that. Stella and I got into a huge fight one night. I can't even remember how it started. She probably said something offhand about me being ungrateful or spoiled. I was 16, frustrated, angry, and I just snapped. I told her she'd never be my mother, that she'd always be the woman who tried to replace her. I'll never forget the look on her face. Cold, calculated, with just a hint of triumph. I realized then that she had been waiting for me to say those words. It didn't take long before she convinced my dad that I needed space and independence. She even suggested it would be best if I moved out after high school, insinuating that it would help me grow. I was 17 and had nowhere else to go, but I knew if I stayed, it would only get worse. I left as soon as I could, couch surfing with friends and working odd jobs to get by. The saddest part? My dad barely fought her on it. I guess by that point, he was too worn down, too invested in making his second marriage work. Over time, I found a way to let go of the bitterness. I went to college, landed a good job, and built a life for myself. I even got my own apartment in the city and had a small circle of friends who felt like family. Jackson, my best friend, was one of the few people who knew everything about Stella and the way things went down. He used to say, "You're better off, Caleb. You don't need people like that in your life." And he was right. I hadn't spoken to Stella or my dad in years. When my dad passed away a few years ago, Stella didn't bother reaching out. I got a notification from some distant relative, and that was it. No closure, no goodbye. Just a text message with the news and a curt, "Sorry for your loss." In a way, it felt like the final nail in the coffin. I assumed that was the end of it, that I'd never hear from her again. Until that voicemail. It was a Tuesday night, and I'd just come home from work, exhausted and ready to crash. I checked my phone to see a missed call and a voicemail from an unknown number. Curiosity got the better of me, so I played it, and there it was, her voice, unmistakably. Older, with a hint of desperation I'd never heard before, but still Stella. "Caleb, it's your stepmother." "Stella, I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you. Please, it's important. Call me back when you can." I just sat there, phone in hand, heart pounding. I hadn't heard her voice in years, and just like that, it was as if every memory I'd buried came flooding back. I thought about deleting the message right then and there. What could she possibly want after all this time? But curiosity got the better of me. The next day, during my lunch break, I found myself dialing her number. She picked up on the first ring. "Caleb." Her voice wavered, and I could tell she was trying to sound composed. It didn't suit her. I remembered Stella as sharp and self-assured. The woman on the other end of the line sounded like a ghost of that person. "Yes, it's me," I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. There was a pause. "Thank you for calling back. I wasn't sure if you'd even answer." "What do you want, Stella?" She sighed, and I could almost picture her biting her lip, searching for the right words. "I know I don't have any right to ask this, Caleb, but I need help. I'm I'm in a bad situation, and you're the only family I have left." I almost laughed at that. Family. She had the nerve to call me that after pushing me out of my own home. But there was something off in her voice, something that kept me from hanging up. "What kind of help?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated, as if testing the waters. I need a place to stay, just for a little while." I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. There it was. The ask. I should have said no, should have ended the call right there. But instead, I found myself saying, "Let me think about it." As soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. This was Stella. She was manipulative, selfish, the kind of person who never did anything without an agenda. And yet, there was a part of me, a small, foolish part, that wondered if maybe, just maybe, things were different now. We ended the call, and I spent the next few days trying to talk myself out of helping her. But the memory of her voice, laced with desperation, stuck with me. It was unsettling, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. Jackson tried to talk sense into me when I told him about it. "Caleb, don't be an idiot. She burned you once, she'll do it again. People like that don't change." He was probably right. But against my better judgment, I found myself calling her again a few days later, telling her she could come over to talk in person. I set up boundaries in my mind, telling myself that this was just a meeting, just a chance to hear her out. Nothing more. Little did I know, letting Stella back into my life, even for a single conversation, would unravel everything I'd built and drag me right back into the chaos I thought I'd escaped. When Stella showed up at my apartment, I barely recognized her. The woman who used to walk around with perfect hair, manicured nails, and an air of superiority now looked almost broken. Her once bright blonde hair was dull and streaked with gray, and her face bore lines that made her look older than I remembered. She wore a coat that looked too thin for the cold, clutching it around her as if it was the only shield she had left. "Caleb," she said, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. As she walked past me, I noticed how thin she'd become. She seemed to be carrying more than just physical weight, a burden that pressed down on her shoulders and made her seem even smaller than she was. We sat down in my tiny living room, and for a few minutes, the silence hung between us, thick and uncomfortable. She looked around, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings and the minimal decor. My apartment wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, a fact I took pride in. Finally, I broke the silence. "So, you said you needed help," I said, trying to keep my tone as neutral as possible. She nodded, taking a shaky breath. "Caleb, I know I'm the last person who deserves any help from you. I don't even know how to start apologizing for everything I did." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Apologies aren't what you're here for, though, are they?" She flinched, and for a brief moment, I saw a flash of the old Stella, the one who hated being challenged. But she quickly hid it, lowering her gaze. "You're right. I've fallen on hard times. After your father passed, things got difficult. Financially, I mean." I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair. "That's funny. I seem to remember you getting everything he left behind. The house, the money, everything." She looked down, fiddling with the strap of her worn-out bag. "It wasn't as much as it seemed, Caleb. I made some poor investments. Trusted the wrong people." I could feel the resentment boiling up inside me, memories of her control, her constant criticisms, her role in pushing me away. But seeing her now, so vulnerable and desperate, stirred something else in me. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was just the part of me that never got closure, that still wanted answers. "And what about Brooke?" I asked, suddenly curious about my former stepsister. Brooke had been a few years younger than me, and while we'd never been particularly close, she'd always looked up to me in her own way. Stella hesitated, her face tightening. Brooke, she left a long time ago. We don't speak anymore. The way she said it, clipped and tense, told me there was more to that story, but I decided not to push it. So, what do you want from me, exactly? I need somewhere to stay, just until I get back on my feet. I wouldn't ask if I had anyone else. She looked at me with pleading eyes, the same eyes she'd used countless times to manipulate my dad, to twist every situation to her advantage. A voice in my head screamed at me to say no, to send her back out the door and shut the past away for good. But there was another part of me, a part one hated to admit existed, that longed for some kind of resolution. Maybe I could finally get the answers I'd wanted for so long. Maybe I could finally understand why she did the things she did. All right, I said slowly, against every instinct I had. You can stay here, but only for a couple of weeks, Stella. After that, you're on your own. Her eyes filled with relief, and she gave me a nod. Thank you, Caleb. I promise I won't be a burden. I doubted that, but the decision was already made. I showed her to the spare room, which was hardly more than a storage space with a futon in the corner. She didn't complain, though, just dropped her bag and sat down on the edge of the bed, looking exhausted. Over the next few days, I learned more about Stella's so-called hard times than I'd ever wanted to know. Apparently, she'd been married again after my dad, to some guy named Derek who turned out to be a con artist. She told me, in far more detail than necessary, about how he'd taken her money, racked up debt in her name, and then vanished. She'd been left with nothing, scrambling to pick up the pieces while fending off debt collectors and trying to stay afloat. At first, I felt a sense of vindication. Here was Stella, the woman who'd controlled and manipulated everyone around her, now getting a taste of her own medicine. But as the days passed, I started to notice other things. The way she'd stare out the window, lost in thought, or the hollow look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I found myself wondering if maybe she'd changed, or at least, if she was capable of change. One evening, as we sat in awkward silence over dinner, she looked at me and said, Caleb, I know you probably think I'm lying about all this, that I'm just here to use you. And I don't blame you for thinking that. I didn't respond, keeping my gaze fixed on my plate. She continued anyway. I know I hurt you. I know I did things that can't be undone. But I also know that losing your father, my second husband, and then everything else, it's made me see things differently. Life has a way of humbling you, even if you don't want it to. I looked up at her then, searching her face for any sign of sincerity. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that maybe she'd been forced to confront her mistakes and was genuinely remorseful. But another part of me knew how skilled she was at spinning stories, at playing the role she thought would get her what she wanted. You say that now, I replied quietly, but you made my life hell for years, Stella. You and I both know that. She nodded, looking down. I know, and I can't take it back. All I can do is tell you that I'm sorry and hope that, someday, you might forgive me. Forgiveness. It felt like too big a word, too heavy for everything we'd been through. But for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, a glimpse of someone who wasn't just the villain in my story. A few days later, I was surprised to come home to the smell of cooking. Stella had never been one to spend much time in the kitchen, preferring to delegate that sort of thing to hired help. But there she was, apron on, stirring something over the stove. I thought I'd make dinner for us, she said, glancing over her shoulder. Thank you for letting me stay. It was strange, this domestic scene with her, as if we were trying to play house, to pretend we were some sort of functional family. I sat down at the table, watching her move around the kitchen with a kind of hesitant grace. She seemed almost normal, and for a moment, I found myself wondering what life would have been like if she'd been like this back then. As we ate, she started telling stories about my dad. Stories I'd never heard, funny little anecdotes about things he'd said or done that somehow never made it into the sanitized version of his life I'd known. She told me about the way he'd sing terribly off-key when he thought no one was listening, or how he'd get ridiculously competitive over board games. It was strange, hearing her talk about him like that. I'd always assumed their relationship had been more of a power play than anything else, but the way she talked, it was almost as if she'd actually loved him, maybe even more than she let on. But then she mentioned something that caught me off guard. You know, she said, her voice soft, your father never stopped talking about your mother. Even when we were together, there was always this part of him that belonged to her. I felt a lump form in my throat, memories of my mom flooding back. She'd been my everything, and when she died, it felt like my world had crumbled. Knowing that my dad had felt the same, that he'd carried her memory with him even after Stella came along, it was strangely comforting. But it also made me wonder, if he loved her so much, why had he let Stella take over, push me out, erase every trace of my mom from our lives? I wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Stella seemed to sense my hesitation, because she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. Caleb, I know I can never make up for what happened, but I'd like to try. If you'll let me. I stared at her hand, feeling a confusing mix of emotions. Anger, sorrow, curiosity, and maybe even a tiny sliver of hope. Could people like Stella really change? Could she actually be sincere? Or was this just another act, another way to worm her way back into my life? As I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I realized that my life was no longer just mine. The past I'd buried was back, sitting across the table from me, demanding to be faced. The following week felt like a surreal kind of test. Stella seemed determined to play the part of a remorseful mother figure, trying to help around the apartment, cooking dinner, even cleaning. I didn't know how to react, really. On the surface, it was almost nice. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was just laying the groundwork for something else, some bigger ask she hadn't revealed yet. One night, I decided to meet up with Jackson. He'd been my sounding board through all of this, offering his no-nonsense perspective that usually pulled me back to reality. We met at a bar near my place, and I filled him in on everything. Stella's sudden domesticity, her stories about my dad, the strange feeling that something still wasn't adding up. Jackson listened, his usual easygoing expression replaced by one of intense scrutiny. Finally, he shook his head, giving me a hard look. Caleb, don't fall for it. People like Stella don't change. They just get better at hiding their motives. I don't know, man, I replied, swirling my drink. She seems different, broken, even, and she's telling me things about my dad that I never knew. He raised an eyebrow. Or maybe she's just telling you what she thinks you want to hear. Look, I know you want to believe she's changed, but ask yourself this, why now? Why is she telling you all this now, after all these years? That was the question that had been nagging at me. Why now? If she truly regretted how things had gone, why hadn't she reached out sooner? Why wait until she was in financial trouble to make amends? Jackson leaned in, lowering his voice. You need to dig into her story. See if she's really down and out, or if this is all some elaborate scheme. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went online and started looking up everything I could find about Stella's life since we'd lost contact. It wasn't hard to find her. She'd left a trail. She'd been in and out of a few relationships, each one seeming to end more disastrously than the last. I even found a few news articles about her and Derek, the man she'd claimed had conned her. They'd apparently been something of a power couple in the community before things went south. There were photos of them at charity events, social gatherings, and then nothing. Just a series of mentions in financial court filings, claims of debt, and repossessions. Still, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The next night, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to confront her. Stella, can I ask you something? She looked up, startled. Of course, Caleb. Anything. Why didn't you reach out to me sooner? I mean, if you really regretted what happened, why did it take you losing everything to want to make things right? She set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't think you'd want to hear from me. After everything I did, I thought you'd hate me. I searched her face for signs of deception, but all I saw was a kind of weary sadness. Maybe she really believed that. Or maybe she was just a better actor than I'd realized. So, what's your plan now? I asked, pressing further. You're not planning on staying here forever, right? She shook her head quickly. No, of course not. I just need a little time to get back on my feet. I was hoping I could find work here in the city, maybe even something small to help me save up for my own place. Her answer seemed reasonable enough, but something about it still didn't sit right with me. That night, I decided to dig a little deeper. I went through her things while she was in the shower, feeling a twinge of guilt but convincing myself it was necessary. She'd left her purse in the kitchen, and inside, I found a folded piece of paper, a letter from a law firm. I scanned the contents, and my blood went cold. The letter detailed a sizable debt Stella owed, one that she'd apparently been avoiding for months. According to the letter, if she didn't start making payments soon, they'd be forced to seize any assets she had left. The words, as a last resort, were underlined in bold, as if to drive home the severity of her situation. Suddenly, it all made sense. She wasn't here to reconnect or make amends. She was here because I was her last option, her final lifeline before everything crumbled. The next morning, I confronted her. Stella, why didn't you tell me about the debt collectors? She froze, her face going pale. I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant? Stella, you're on the verge of losing everything, and you think that's not relevant? You came here, played this whole remorseful act, and you didn't even think to mention that? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy this time. Caleb, please. I didn't want you to feel obligated. I thought maybe if I could just get a little help, I'd be able to take care of it myself. Obligated? I scoffed. Stella, you've always had a way of making people feel obligated to you. That's your whole thing. You manipulate people until they give in, and then you leave them high and dry. Isn't that exactly what you did to Dad? She recoiled, the hurt in her eyes looking almost real. That's not fair. I loved your father. I may not have been perfect, but I loved him. I shook my head. You loved what he could give you. There's a difference. She stood there, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she sighed, slumping into a chair. Maybe you're right. Maybe I was selfish, and maybe I took advantage of him. But Caleb, I'm here now, asking for your help. Isn't that worth something? I wanted to tell her no, that it wasn't worth anything, but a part of me, a foolish, hopeful part, wanted to believe that maybe there was some sliver of sincerity in her. In the days that followed, I found myself caught between two impulses: protect myself from her manipulation and see if there was any truth to her regret. She continued staying at my apartment, but the atmosphere was tense. I could tell she knew I was suspicious, and she began tiptoeing around me, her usual assertiveness replaced with cautiousness. Then, one evening, she came to me with another bombshell. I need to tell you something about your mother, she said, her voice barely a whisper. My heart stopped. My mother was always a sensitive topic, and Stella had never talked about her much before. I braced myself, unsure of what was coming. Your father. He was still in love with her when he married me, she said slowly, her eyes downcast. I tried to fill the void, but I was never enough. I knew that, deep down. He kept things from me, things about her, secrets he never shared. I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. What secrets? She shook her head, a bitter smile on her face. I never found out, but he had a whole drawer of letters and notes he kept locked away. I tried to ask him about it once, but he wouldn't tell me anything. Something stirred in me, a need to know what my dad had been hiding. Stella looked at me, her gaze piercing. I think you deserve to know, Caleb. If you can find those letters, maybe you'll find the answers you're looking for. I didn't know what to believe. Was she trying to deflect from her own issues, or was she genuinely trying to help me find closure? Either way, I found myself drawn into her story, unable to resist the pull of finally uncovering the truth about my father and mother's relationship. A few days later, I went to our old house. The memories flooded back as I walked up the familiar steps, the smell of the lawn, the creak of the porch. Stella had sold the place, of course, but part of me had to see it, to see if the drawer she'd mentioned was still there. I walked around to the back, where an old tree still stood, one my dad used to sit under with me when I was little. It felt surreal, standing there as an adult, trying to piece together the fragments of my past. When I returned home, Stella was waiting for me. She looked at me expectantly, almost hopeful, as if she thought I'd found something monumental. I shook my head. The house is different now. They remodeled it. If there were any secrets, they're gone now. Disappointment flickered across her face, and she slumped back, muttering, I was so sure. We were back to square one, no closer to understanding my parents or the mysterious secrets she hinted at. But as I looked at Stella, a new question gnawed at me. Was she really trying to help me uncover my past, or was she just trying to keep me entangled in hers? A week passed after my visit to the old house, and life at the apartment returned to a strained kind of normalcy. Stella seemed subdued, almost as if the hope of unearthing some long-buried truth had given her a purpose. But after finding nothing, she slipped back into a strange silence, occasionally casting me these guarded, wary glances, like she was waiting for something to explode. And in a way, I was too. The tension between us had reached a boiling point, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, she approached me, looking hesitant. Caleb, I think there's something you should know. About your mother. I'd heard her say this before, but there was a different weight to her words now. I set down the dish towel, crossing my arms. What is it, Stella? She took a deep breath, her hands clasped together tightly. When your father married me, he was still struggling with Hannah's death. You know that much. But what you don't know is that he wasn't just grieving her. He was haunted by guilt. Guilt, I repeated, frowning. She nodded, her eyes flicking to mine before quickly looking away. Yes. He told me once, in a moment of weakness, that he blamed himself for what happened to her. I stared at her, struggling to keep my voice steady. Stella, my mom died of cancer. There was nothing he could have done. I know, she whispered, biting her lip, but he felt like he'd failed her somehow. Like if he'd been a better husband, or more attentive, he would have seen it coming sooner. That's why he held on to those letters. They were his way of keeping her memory alive. And his guilt, the words hit me harder than I expected. My dad had always seemed so strong, so solid, even during the hardest times. To think of him carrying that kind of pain, hiding it away from everyone, it changed the way I saw him. But there was something else gnawing at me, something I couldn't ignore. You knew all this time, I said slowly, anger simmering beneath the surface. You knew he was struggling, and you still pushed me out. You didn't even give me a chance to understand what he was going through. She looked down, her face twisted with regret. I was selfish, Caleb. I was young, insecure. I wanted him to love me the way he loved her, but I knew I could never compete with her memory. So, I did what I thought I had to. I tried to erase her, and you, the honesty in her voice was disarming, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so many years hating her, blaming her for everything that went wrong. But now, hearing her admit to her mistakes, it was like the ground shifted beneath me. As the days went on, Stella started opening up more, revealing details about her past with my father, her regrets, and her failed attempts to connect with me. She told me about her marriage to Derek, how she thought he'd be her fresh start after my father's death, only to find herself used and discarded once again. In a strange way, it felt like she was finally being real with me, showing a side of herself I hadn't seen before. Then, one night, she dropped another bombshell. Caleb, there's something else you need to know. Something about Brooke. I tensed, suddenly wary. What about her? She looked down, twisting her hands together. Brooke, she's not just my daughter. She's your half-sister. My mind went blank, my breath catching in my throat. What? Your father, before he met your mother, he and we had a brief relationship. We were both young, and it didn't last. He moved on, met Hannah, and I thought that was the end of it. But then, years later, after Hannah's death, we reconnected, and that's when I came back into your life. My head spun, 1,000 questions crashing into each other. So you were with my dad twice? Once before he married my mom, and then again after she died. She nodded, a look of shame on her face. Yes, I never told him about Brooke. By the time I came back into his life, it felt too late, and I was afraid he'd see me differently if he knew the truth. I didn't know what to say. The idea of Brooke, the girl I'd grown up with, being my sister, it was surreal. And the fact that my father had died never knowing that Stella had kept it from him, it was almost too much to process. For days, I couldn't even look at her. I felt betrayed, like every piece of my childhood had been twisted, distorted. But at the same time, there was this strange sense of connection to Brooke, a girl I'd once considered just a stepsister but now realized was so much more. Eventually, I decided I had to find Brooke to tell her the truth. It was the least she deserved, and maybe it would help me find some closure, too. Stella gave me a contact number she had for Brooke, warning me that they hadn't spoken in years, and there was no telling how she'd react. When I called, the voice on the other end was hesitant but familiar. "Hello?" Brooke's voice was softer than I remembered, tinged with caution. "It's Caleb," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. "Caleb, I never expected to hear from you again." "I know, but there's something we need to talk about. It's important." After a moment of hesitation, she agreed to meet me. We chose a quiet cafe in the city, a neutral ground where we could face the truth without distractions. When she walked in, I was struck by how much she'd changed. She looked older, more guarded, with an air of resilience that hadn't been there when we were kids. She sat across from me, her eyes searching mine with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "So," she said, folding her hands on the table, "what's this about?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Brooke, there's something I need to tell you. It's about us. About our family." Her eyebrows knit together, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind, piecing together what I was about to say. "You're my sister, Brooke," I said, the words feeling heavy and surreal. "My half-sister. Stella told me everything." She blinked, staring at me in shock. For a moment, she looked like she might laugh, like it was all some kind of joke. But then, the realization set in, and her face crumpled. "All these years," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All this time, and no one told me?" "I didn't know either," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "I just found out myself. I thought you deserved to know the truth." She sat back, looking away as she processed the revelation. I could see the pain in her eyes, the same sense of betrayal that I'd felt when Stella had told me. We were both victims of the same twisted web, and for the first time, I felt a sense of solidarity with her. After a long silence, she looked back at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I always felt like I didn't belong, like there was something off about our family. I thought it was just me, but now it all makes sense." I reached out, placing a hand on hers. "We both got caught up in her lies, Brooke, but now we know the truth. We don't have to be strangers anymore." She nodded, a small, tentative smile breaking through the storm of emotions on her face. Maybe this is a chance for us to start over, to be the family we never had." Over the next few weeks, Brooke and I started to build a relationship, tentatively reaching out to each other, sharing stories, reconnecting. It was strange, like rediscovering a missing part of myself. Despite everything, I found myself grateful for the chance to know her, to finally understand the connection we'd had all along. But there was still Stella. She was still in my apartment, still a constant reminder of the past and the chaos she brought into our lives. And while part of me wanted to believe she was sincere in her regrets, another part of me knew that she'd caused damage that couldn't be undone. One night, I sat down with her, ready to lay everything out. "Stella, I appreciate that you told me the truth about Brooke, but you have to understand, I can't keep you in my life. Not like this." She looked at me, her face unreadable. "Caleb, please. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make things right. You can't make up for everything you've done by just saying you're sorry," I replied, my voice firm. "You've manipulated me, lied to me, kept secrets that changed my life. I can't forgive that." For a moment, I thought she'd argue, that she'd try to convince me to give her another chance. But instead, she just nodded, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "I understand," she said quietly. Maybe it's too late for forgiveness. But I'm glad I got to know you again, even if it was only for a little while. The next morning, she was gone. She left a note on the kitchen table, thanking me for letting her stay and apologizing once again for everything she'd done. I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with a sadness I couldn't quite explain. As I read her note, I realized that Stella was just a person, flawed and broken, struggling to find redemption in the only way she knew how. And while I couldn't forgive her, I could finally let go of the anger I'd carried for so long. Brooke and I kept in touch, slowly building a relationship that felt real and genuine. And in the end, Stella's reappearance in my life had given me something unexpected, a connection to the sister I never knew I had. With Stella gone, the apartment felt emptier than I expected. She left a presence, like the ghost of every unresolved emotion I had toward her. But her departure, rather than bringing peace, left me with an unexpected sense of loss, a realization that, for better or worse, she'd shaped who I was. Over the next few weeks, I focused on building my relationship with Brooke. She quickly became more than just a sister. She was my friend, someone who understood parts of me that no one else could. We met regularly, sharing stories about our fragmented childhoods, laughing over the absurdities of growing up under Stella's manipulative influence. She was smart, funny, resilient, and I found myself grateful that, despite everything, Stella's return had reconnected us. One evening, after work, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, assuming it was spam, but something told me to answer. Caleb. It was Stella's voice, but it sounded different, fragile, scared. Stella? Why are you calling me? I asked, suspicion flaring up instantly. I know I don't deserve your help, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm desperate, Caleb. I have nowhere else to turn. A part of me wanted to hang up right there. I'd given her a second chance, let her back into my life, only for her to leave without a word. But then she said something that caught my attention. It's about Brooke. That one name changed everything. What do you mean? It's about Brooke? I demanded. I didn't want to tell you before, but I had some debts that I thought I could pay off on my own. It turns out, the people I owe, they're dangerous, Caleb. They've been asking about Brooke. I don't know what to do. I'm scared they'll go after her if I can't pay. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Brooke was finally finding stability, finally connecting with family she didn't know she had. The last thing I wanted was for her to be dragged into Stella's mess again. What do you need? I asked, my voice hard, bracing myself. There's a debt, Caleb. I thought I could manage it on my own, but I was wrong. I'm asking you, please help me. If not for me, then for Brooke's safety. I clenched my fist, every fiber of my being screaming against helping her again. But the thought of Brooke, innocent in all this, vulnerable to whatever shadows Stella had lurking in her past, kept me from hanging up. Where are you? I asked, my voice resigned. She gave me an address, a rundown motel on the edge of town. The kind of place that reeked of desperation and last resorts. I grabbed my keys, called Brooke to let her know I'd be out late, and made my way over. When I got there, Stella looked even worse than before. Her face pale, eyes red-rimmed from what looked like days of sleepless nights. She motioned me to sit, wringing her hands nervously. Caleb, I know this isn't fair to ask, but I need to come up with the money by next week, or... She trailed off, but I could hear the fear in her voice. I took a deep breath, the words forming before I could stop myself. Stella, I'll help you this one last time, but only because I want to protect Brooke. After this, we're done. Completely. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you, Caleb. I don't deserve this, but thank you. In the following days, I arranged a loan, one that would cover Stella's debt and ensure Brooke's safety. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. It was a significant financial risk, but I knew I'd never forgive myself if I let Brooke get pulled into Stella's mess. The day the loan cleared, Stella called, her voice cracking with gratitude. You saved me, Caleb. You saved us, she whispered. I don't know how I can ever repay you. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She'd been a part of my life for too long, her presence like a shadow that refused to leave. But this time, I was finally ready to let go. After settling her debt, Stella disappeared. Brooke and I never heard from her again, and while there was a part of me that wondered where she went, the rest of me was just relieved. I was finally free of her influence, able to focus on my life and the family I'd chosen. Brooke and I grew closer, finding in each other the strength to move on from the wreckage Stella had left behind. And while forgiveness felt impossible, I found peace in the choice to let go, to build a future unburdened by the past. In a strange way, Stella's final plea had given me what I'd been searching for all along: the chance to protect someone I loved and the freedom to live on my own terms.